On December 6, 1944, my mother, Carmen González, was born in Puerto Rico. The ninth child in a family of 12, my mom was raised alongside her brothers and sisters in the Catholic Church. Central to my mom's upbringing was living each day guided by the 3 theological virtues that are part of the first teachings children encounter in the church. For my mom, these virtues, fe, esperanza, y caridad, faith, hope, and charity, were crucial to her family's teaching about love, compassion, and forgiveness. When my mother was 4 years old, she stopped talking and entered what her siblings described as a trance. Because medical care was scarce in those days in the rural area they lived, my grandparents traveled by horse and buggy to the county hospital to seek medical care. Upon seeing the doctor, my grandparents were told my mom would not survive if she didn't eat or if she didn't speak. Shortly after my mom's 7th birthday, after not speaking for more than 3 years, my grandfather was feeding my mother when all of a sudden she turned to him and looked and said, "Can I have some more?" For my grandfather, that was a miracle. My mother's upbringing wasn't easy. At 8 years old, she went to school for a few years, and she stopped attending after the 3rd grade. You see, my mom's family was poor, and as a result, my mother and her siblings spent most of their childhood working in the sugarcane and tobacco fields. The trauma my mom experienced was food insecurity and childhood poverty. And while she can't pinpoint what happened to her that caused her to lose her voice for 3 years, she and I both know that she must have experienced a traumatic event that impacted her memory and took away her ability to speak. Few of us will get through life unscathed by trauma. According to the organization PTSD Alliance, 70% of adults in America will experience at least one traumatic event in their lives. Whatever the trauma experienced or witnessed, if it's physical, emotional, psychological, or racial, these events leave deep wounds and feelings of hopelessness. For me, trauma has been present in my personal and my professional career. While it has caused much pain and hurt, I've discovered that post-traumatic healing has provided opportunities for growth. Today, I plan to speak with you about how hope manifested itself throughout many points of my life, where trauma caused me to struggle and suffer. My story starts with telling you about some of the traumatic events in my life, and those moments where hope was present. In 1978, while in my 7th grade American history class, I was learning about Teddy Roosevelt's presidency and his role as a Rough Rider, and my teacher mentioned Puerto Rico. In this class, I often lost myself because the only narratives focused on wars and presidents. On this day, when my teacher, Mr. Hogan, talked about Teddy Roosevelt's accomplishments, I asked, what was the role of Puerto Ricans at this time? Well, I cannot remember word for word what he said. I do remember the sting of these 4 words. Your people were slaughtered. The shock of Mr. Hogan's words left a sinking feeling in my stomach as tears burned my eyes. I could not speak. What happened to me in that moment was not physical trauma, but an emotional trauma caused by a lesson masqueraded as teaching. I was silenced, and I lost my voice in that class for the remainder of the year. Upon telling my mom what happened in the classroom, she scheduled a weekend trip for my brothers and me to visit Taller Puertorriqueño, a center dedicated to Latino culture. Together, we combed through books where I learned about the Puerto Rican diaspora and the history of the people from the island of Borinquen. My mother dismantled these narratives and affirmed my identity and culture by exposing me to our history. What I know today is that every level of education continues to be impacted by the presence of historical and racial trauma. Did Mr. Hogan see the impact of his words on me? Did he know that at that moment he was participating in erasing the historical narrative that rendered my ancestors invisible? I'm sure he had no idea that his classroom practice included what Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie calls the danger of the single story. Mr. Hogan provided my classmates and me stories that reinforced and perpetuated the telling of historical narratives and power structures that, when repeated over and over and over again, became someone's truth and silenced someone else's history. Here I am in 2021 telling all of you that 54-year-old Yolanda remembers the impact of what 11-year-old Yolanda experienced in that classroom. It was my mother's compassion that helped me discover that everyone has a story to tell. From that moment, I wanted to learn the story of all people. Little did I know that I was beginning to live toward the hope for tomorrow I created for myself as a kid. I wish Mr. Hogan knew that when I decided to become an educator, the influence he had on me was my promise that I would not teach like him, and that my classroom practice would center the voices of those perspectives he helped to marginalize when I was in 7th grade. I grew up in the 1970s and 80s in North Philadelphia's Old Kensington neighborhood, an enclave for poor and blue-collar families. It was once a hub for World War II factory production. By the 1950s, Old Kensington experienced deindustrialization and residential abandonment. It is where, in 1973, my father purchased a 3-story, 4-bedroom home for our family. In the early 1980s, crack cocaine made its way into many neighborhoods throughout the United States, and Philadelphia's city streets were not immune from this. The height of the crack epidemic was from 1985 to 1990. My neighborhood experienced a rapid decline as the lure of fast money in an area that was economically depressed turned many young people into slinging rocks. For some of the peers I grew up with, the hope for a better future was in selling crack. For me, avoiding the drug epidemic meant charting a path that involved going to college. I took the road less traveled. By the time I graduated from college and returned to live with my parents, drugs had come into my family. I soon discovered a few of my cousins made choices that resulted in drug abuse, drug dealing, or incarceration. I experienced a ton of stress and anxiety when I decided to move back into the neighborhood. In 1990, I learned that my cousin Evelise was caught up in the world of drugs. By the time she was 21, Evelise had 3 little girls, all under the age of 5. Unfortunately, the wave of violence that came along with drugs did not escape Evelise. On December 31st, 1990, my father received a call from my Aunt Lucia, informing us that Evelise had not come home the night before, and that earlier in the day, she was found dead in an abandoned house where she was tied up and killed with a fatal gunshot to her face. My parents and I went to pay our respects and attend Evelise's viewing. Upon entering the funeral home, I quickly got a glimpse of the lifestyle that lured Evelise. She was caught up in the world where being able to provide for her 3 daughters meant taking risks associated with drugs, even if it meant her death. As I walked with my parents to greet my Aunt Lucia, she held a baby, and sitting on either side of her were 2 little girls. These were my cousin's children. This moment has remained engraved in my memory. The sadness and fear I saw in their eyes reminded me of what my mother always said each time something tragic came into our life. She'd say, "Some days will be really sad, but have faith and hope there'll be better days to come." In the days that followed after her funeral, Evelise became known as the 494th victim in a city that saw over 500 murders each year during the height of the crack epidemic. The prevalence of today's issues around gun violence and our current students' interest in collective action always brings me back to all the young people I knew who were victims of gun violence. Each time students want to engage in letter writing campaigns, attend a protest, or make phone calls, I'm reminding of the hope I have for today's young people. In the summer of 2001, after spending years as a social worker assigned to counsel adjudicated youth in Philadelphia's juvenile court, and 2 years as a caseworker, I decided to go into the classroom. Under the No Child Left Behind Act, I was one of thousands of career-changing professionals throughout the country who entered teaching. In September 2001, I was assigned to teach at Kensington High School, the comprehensive school named for the neighborhood I grew up in and called home. On my first day in the classroom, I remember how nervous I was to meet the students I would teach and advise for the year. As I was preparing for my first class and was organizing materials for my lesson, a young girl sat at a desk close to mine and in a whisper asked, "Do they call you Jolie?" This is a nickname members of my family call me. I looked at her and responded, "Yes." She then asked, "Do you have an aunt named Lucia?" This kid had my full attention as I again answered, "Yes." As I looked at her, my heart sank and tears came to my eyes as I heard her say, I'm Evelise, the 4-year-old, and Lucia, who's in your advisory, is the 5-year-old. On my first day as an educator, my cousin Evalise's two oldest daughters, named after her and her mother, were those little girls who sat on either side of my aunt during my cousin's viewing. These girls showed up in my classroom and were now my students. As you can imagine, I was an emotional mess on my first day of school. The only time I had seen these girls was at the viewing in 1991, 10 years prior. During my lunch period, I arranged to meet with the girls and talk with them. I had no idea what I would say, but it was not I who did the talking. The girls were very open about the last 10 years of their lives. Lucia and Evalise, I soon discovered, were living with the cyclical poverty, emotional trauma, and the demons that enveloped their mother when she was their age. When Evalise was alive, crack was ravaging the Kensington section of North Philadelphia. By 2001, the opioid crisis was soon becoming the epicenter of the neighborhood where the girls called home. During this first year of teaching, the students in my classroom were directly impacted by intergenerational and transgenerational trauma. Each day presented many challenges for them. I quickly discovered some of my students are taking care of siblings, numbing themselves by using drugs, victims of abuse, food insecure, living with drug-addicted parents, working to help their families, and dealing with a range of mental health issues. One thing was clear. My students showed up every day to school, and while I was ready to teach my lessons, I was also prepared to hear their voices. I spent many hours writing curriculum that made connections between their learning and their lived experiences, which I continue to prioritize. Today, my instructional practice is not different than the one I used in 2001. While I'm in an environment that doesn't mirror that of my first few years of teaching, it doesn't mean I've forgotten the authentic narratives that became part of my lessons in 2001. The content in a few of my courses is now centered around the topics related to some of my former students and their families' real-life experiences. When I teach about mass incarceration, food insecurity, mental health, the war on drugs, the opioid epidemic, childhood trauma, breaking the cycles of poverty and addiction, juvenile justice, criminal justice reform, and the decolonization of the curriculum, my lessons are given a voice to those students who came into my classroom carrying their trauma, while at the same time curious to learn about the world. My mother's teaching about hope and compassion was a constant reminder that everyone has a story to tell. In my teaching, I've known that I wanted to be the history teacher who tells the story of the people whose narratives and lived experiences didn't make it into history textbooks. How have the traumatic events I experienced at various points in my schooling and experienced by students I've taught defined me as an educator? Well, I've been able to bring our narratives into the classroom. What I've realized is that the trauma I experienced was not an endpoint for me. I didn't let my trauma make me a statistic. I've spent my teaching career using this trauma as a way to grow, heal, reflect, and inspire my students to use the stories of the people I bring into the classroom as a spark to inspire change. My mother's constant reminder of seeing hope in all my students served as a catalyst for the transformative experiences that have allowed me to be the type of educator that builds relationships with my students and learns their stories. This approach is paramount to my teaching. How can I teach you if I don't take the time to get to know you? As I speak to you now, my Theories of Punishment class is currently working on a case study involving 3 of my former students who in 2003 were incarcerated to life without parole for a murder they committed when they were 16 and 17. Through the lens of justice, my current students are using what we know now about decision-making in the juvenile brain as they reimagine what punishment would look like today if the trauma and lived experiences of my former students had been taken into account during their trial. My mother gave me the strength to stand tall and proud, even on my darkest days. She taught me to lend a helping hand whenever I could, to learn and grow from these moments where I felt hope escaped me. She told me that the failures I would encounter would make me stronger. And in order to develop empathy and courage, I needed to allow myself to stand in someone else's shoes and hope for a better tomorrow. In my words, my deeds, and my teaching, I hope I'm delivering a love letter to my mother each day. Peace activist and Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh once said, Hope is important because it can make the present moment less difficult to bear. If we believe that tomorrow will be better, we can bear hardship today. We all have the potential to elevate the voices of those silenced in our society. I wonder whose story you will tell.